The morning of Lily's 5th birthday started the way every parent dreams a child's birthday should begin, with golden September sunlight streaming through sheer curtains, the smell of buttercream frosting drifting up from the kitchen below, and the sound of tiny feet hitting hardwood floors at an hour that no reasonable adult would consider morning. My daughter had been awake since before 5, too excited to sleep, too full of anticipation to lie still. And by the time I shuffled downstairs in my robe and slippers, she was already sitting at the kitchen table in her pajamas, hands folded neatly in front of her, waiting with the particular patience that only children who are absolutely certain something wonderful is coming can manage. "Is it today, Daddy?" she asked, even though she already knew. We had been counting down for 2 weeks. "It's today," Bug I told her, and watched her face transform into something that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. We had moved into the Willowbrook Estates neighborhood 14 months earlier, my wife Dana and I, after years of apartment living and the slow accumulation of the kind of life that eventually demands a yard. A real yard, with grass and dirt and room for a swing set. Lily had been 3 when we moved in, just barely beginning to understand what a home was. And she had taken to Willowbrook the way children take to anything that feels safe and permanent. Completely, without reservation, with her whole heart. She loved the cul-de-sac at the end of our street where the neighborhood kids gathered on summer evenings. She loved Mrs. Peterman next door, who always had lemon drops in a glass dish by her front door. She loved the big oak tree in our backyard that Dana and I had promised would one day hold a TREEHOUSE for Lily's 5th birthday. We had planned a garden party, not an elaborate, catered, Instagram-worthy affair. We weren't those parents. And frankly, we didn't have that kind of budget, but something genuinely lovely. Dana had spent 3 weekends transforming our backyard into a fairy garden. There were paper lanterns strung between the oak tree and the fence posts. There were wildflowers in mason jars arranged on folding tables covered with mint green tablecloths. There were little mushroom decorations and butterfly cutouts and a hand-lettered banner that read Lily's Fairy Garden 5 years magical and Dana's careful. Deliberate script, ... And then there was the dress. I need you to understand what this dress meant, because without that understanding, nothing that comes later will hit the way it should. Lily had seen it in a store window 3 months before her birthday and had stopped walking, just stopped, mid-stride, and pressed her face to the glass. It was a lavender tulle dress with tiny embroidered flowers along the bodice and a skirt that moved when she turned. The kind of dress that seems to exist specifically for the purpose of making little girls feel like they have stepped directly into the pages of a storybook. It was $62, which is not an extraordinary amount of money to some people, and is a genuinely significant amount of money to others. And for us, at that particular moment in our lives, it fell somewhere in between, possible, but only if we were thoughtful about it. Dana bought it without telling me. She put it on layaway and paid it off in 3 installments over the following weeks. And she showed it to me 2 days before the party with the quiet pride of someone who has done something they know is exactly right. I held the dress up in the kitchen light, watched the tulle catch, and hold the afternoon glow, and I thought, Lily is going to lose her mind. We had invited 12 children from the neighborhood in Lily's preschool class. We had planned games, a fairy scavenger hunt, pin the wings on the butterfly, a flower crown making station with real dried flowers that Dana had ordered online. We had a cake shaped like a mushroom with a tiny fairy sitting on top, ordered from the bakery on 5th Street by a woman named Rosa who had been decorating cakes for 30 years and whose work was, without exaggeration, extraordinary. Everything was ready. Everything was right. What I had not planned for, what no reasonable person could have planned for, because no reasonable person would have imagined it necessary, was Margaret Holloway. Margaret Holloway had lived in Will Estates for 11 years. She was the kind of neighbor who exists in every planned community. The kind of person who treats the HOA rulebook the way some people treat sacred scripture, with absolute conviction, zero flexibility, and a slightly unsettling gleam in the eye when an opportunity for enforcement presents itself. She had, in our 14 months in the neighborhood, knocked on our door 4 times. Once because our recycling bin was 3 inches over the property line. Once because Dana's hanging flower baskets were, according to Margaret, an unapproved exterior modification. Once because Lily's chalk drawings on our own driveway were, in Margaret's estimation, visible from the street in a way that she found aesthetically objectionable. And once for a reason so trivial that I have genuinely blocked it from my memory as a form of psychological self-preservation. We had done our best to be accommodating. We moved the bin, we took down the hanging baskets, though Dana cried a little, quietly, in the kitchen. We told Lily that the chalk drawings needed to stay closer to the garage. We smiled at Margaret when we saw her checking the mail. We waved from the car window. We had done everything right. We had no idea that none of it wouldn't matter. We had no idea that on the morning of our daughter's 5th birthday, with the lanterns hung and the flowers arranged and the magical lavender dress laid carefully across Lily's bed in tissue paper, Margaret Holloway had already decided that our happiness was, in some fundamental way, an inconvenience she was not prepared to tolerate. The party was scheduled to begin at 11 in Spagna by 10:45. Everything that could go wrong already had. The first sign that something was wrong came at 10:15, when I heard the latch on our backyard gate click open. I was in the kitchen cutting fruit into star shapes, a detail Lily had requested specifically because Farisea, she had informed me with great authority, preferred star-shaped fruit, and I looked up through the sliding glass door to see Margaret Holloway letting herself into our backyard, with the casual confidence of someone who has never once in her life considered whether her presence somewhere is welcome. She was dressed, as she almost always was, in pressed, khaki slacks, and a collared blouse, her silver hair, cut in the kind of precise bob that suggests a standing appointment with a very particular hairdresser. She was carrying a clipboard. She was always carrying a clipboard. I had begun to wonder, in my darker moments, whether Margaret slept with the clipboard, whether it had somehow fused to her person over the years and was now as natural a part of her silhouette as her arms. I set down my knife and went to the back door. "Margaret," I said, sliding it open, keeping my voice pleasant with the particular effort that had become second nature around her. "We're not quite ready for guests yet. The party doesn't start until 11. She didn't look at me. She was looking at the backyard, at the lanterns, the tables, the decorations, the flower-crowned station, the small cluster of mushroom figurines Dana had arranged along the garden path. Her expression was the expression of someone cataloging evidence. "Mr. Callahan," she said, which was technically correct but felt, as it always did from her mouth, like a small subtle insult. "I've received several complaints." "Complaints," I repeated, "about the party setup." She finally looked at me. "The lanterns you've hung between your tree and the fence posts constitute an unapproved exterior decoration. The tables you've set up in the side yard. That portion of the yard is technically common area adjacent, which means any setup requires prior approval from the board, and those," she gestured toward the mushroom figurines with the pen end of her clipboard, "are not permitted as yard ornaments under the decorative item restrictions, which were updated last spring." I stared at her. I want to be accurate here. I stared at her for a long moment, processing what she was saying, comparing it against the reality of what she was looking at, which was a little girl's birthday party setup, and trying to find the place in any reasonable human framework where these two things connected. "Margaret," I said, carefully, "it's my daughter's 5th birthday party. I understand that. The guests are going to be 5-year-olds. The bylaws apply, regardless of age." Dana appeared behind me, having heard voices, and I felt her hand land on my arm in the way that meant, "I've got this. Please don't say what you're thinking." Dana was better at this than I was. Dana possessed a patience in the face of absurdity that I genuinely admired and occasionally resented in equal measure. "Margaret," Dana said, her voice warm and steady, "we'd love to make sure we're doing everything correctly. Okay, you'll leave us your notes, and we'll look everything over after the party this afternoon. We have about 30 minutes before guests arrive, and I still need to get Lily into her dress." Something moved in Margaret's expression. It wasn't warmth. It was something more complicated than that. Something that I would spend a great deal of time thinking about later, trying to name. It was, I think, the expression of someone who has been offered a reasonable exit and is deciding whether or not to take it. She didn't take it. "I'm going to need you to remove the lanterns before the party begins," she said, "and I'll need documentation that those tables have been moved back within your primary yard boundary." Dana's hand tightened on my arm. I took a breath. "We'll do what we can," I said, and I began to close the sliding door. What happened next occurred in a space of perhaps 4 seconds, and those 4 seconds have played back in my memory so many times since then that they have taken on the particular quality of a scene from a movie, something simultaneously real and unreal. Something that the rational mind keeps trying to reframe as less than what it was. Lily came running out from inside the house. She had gotten into her dress by herself, had apparently been so excited, so ready, that she had put it on without waiting for help, and she had done a reasonably impressive job of it for a 5-year-old, though the buttons at the back were not quite aligned. She came through the sliding door at a run, the lavender tulle catching the morning light, and she ran straight toward the decorated garden path, toward the mushrooms, toward the lanterns, toward all of it, her arms out, her face full of the pure animal joy of a child seeing something beautiful that was made specifically for her. She ran directly toward Margaret Holloway, or more precisely, she ran past Margaret Holloway, close enough that the full skirt of the lavender dress brushed against Margaret's arm, and Margaret, whether from surprise, or irritation, or something else, something I still struggle to attribute to any person I want to believe is fundamentally decent, reached out and grabbed this skirt. I don't know if she meant to pull. I don't know if she meant for Lily to go down. I've told myself, in my more generous moments, that it was a reflex, a grab for balance, an accident, but here is what I know. She grabbed the tulle skirt of my daughter's birthday dress, and Lily went down hard, forward, into the garden bed at the edge of the path, the one Dana had watered that morning, the one that was still wet and soft, and the dress went with her, the lavender tulle that, Dana had paid for in 3 careful installments was in the mud. And Margaret Holloway laughed. It was not a big laugh. It was not the laugh of someone who found something genuinely funny. The loose and unguarded sound that real laughter makes when it escapes a person. It was small and sharp and brief. More of a sound than a laugh. Really. The kind of noise that a person makes when something they have been suppressing finally surfaces for just a moment before they can pull it back. But it was unmistakable. I heard it. Dana heard it. And Lily, lying in the mud in her ruined dress, heard it too. Lily didn't cry immediately. She pushed herself up on her hands and knees first. The way children do when they fall. The pause before the assessment. The moment of silence, while the body and the brain compare notes. She looked down at herself. She looked at the mud on her hands, on her dress, on the tulle that was now the color of wet earth. She looked at the embroidered flowers on the bodice, which were intact but streaked. She looked at the skirt, which had taken the worst of it. Then she looked up at Margaret Holloway, and then she cried. It was the kind of crying that lives below the throat. The kind that starts in the chest and comes out all at once. Not the practiced, strategic crying of a child angling for something, but the raw and absolute grief of a child who does not yet have the language or the framework to understand why something wonderful has been taken from her. She cried with her whole body, and it was one of the worst sounds I have ever heard. And I have heard some bad sounds in my life. I was at her side before I knew I had moved. Dana was at her side a half-second behind me. We lifted her up and held her, both of us, in the way that parents sometimes need both hands for one child. And I could feel her shaking, and I could feel the wet mud on my shirt, and I was aware in the dim, distant way that you become aware of secondary things during a primary crisis that Margaret Holloway was still standing 3 feet away, clipboard in hand, and that her expression had settled back into its customary blankness. That was an accident, she said. I looked at her over Lily's head. I said nothing. Children should watch where they're going, she added. I want to be honest about what happened in me in that moment, because honesty is the only thing that makes a story like this worth telling. What happened was not a blaze of righteous anger, though anger was certainly present. It was something colder and more precise, a clarifying, the way certain chemicals clarify a solution, pulling all the sediment down to the bottom so that what's above is suddenly perfectly clear. I understood, in that moment, who Margaret Holloway was. Not a difficult neighbor, not a nuisance, not a person misapplying rules with misguided sincerity. She was someone who had just watched a 5-year-old child fall into the mud on her birthday, and who had laughed, and who had then reached for the nearest explanation that placed no responsibility on herself. That was who she was, and I was done pretending otherwise. Get off my property, I said. Dana looked at me. She knew my voice, and she knew what it meant when it sounded like that, quiet and flat. Without heat, which is, she has told me, more frightening than shouting. Mr. Callahan, I'm here in my capacity as HOA. You grabbed my daughter, I said. You grabbed her dress? She fell, and you laughed. Get off my property. I did not grab, I saw it. My wife saw it, and if you don't leave in the next 30 seconds, I'm going to call the police and let them sort out whose version of events is more plausible. I shifted Lily in my arms. 30 seconds. Margaret. She left. Not quickly. She left with the measured pace of someone who wants it understood, that they are leaving on their own terms. But she left. Dana took Lily inside. I stood in the backyard for a moment, in the sun, with the lanterns hanging above me, and the flower crown station, waiting for 30 minutes from now, and the mushroom figurines standing in their careful arrangement along the garden path. And I thought about what it meant to live next door to someone like Margaret Holloway, and what, exactly, I was going to do about it. Tinset. Dana was working a miracle. She had gotten Lily out of the dress and into the bathroom, and she was running warm water and talking to Lily in the low, unhurried voice she used when things were bad and she needed them to be better. She was telling Lily that the dress could be washed. She was telling Lily that mud was not forever. She was telling Lily that the party was still happening, that the mushrooms were still there, that the flower crowns were still waiting. But she laughed, Lily said. I heard it from the hallway. She laughed when I cried. I know, Dana said. That wasn't kind. Why did she do that? I leaned my forehead against the hallway wall and closed my eyes. Some people, Dana said, after a pause that was only a half-second long but contained. I felt a great deal of thought. Forget what it feels like to be little. And when you forget that, you forget why it matters. Lily was quiet for a moment. I don't want to forget ya. Won't? Dana said. I promise you won't. By the time the first guests arrived at 11, Lily was in the dress which Dana had spot cleaned with a combination of dish soap, cold water, and the specific focused determination that she brings to things that matter. And while the tulle still showed faint discoloration in 2 places if you looked closely, nobody at a 5-year-old's birthday party looks closely at anything except cake and games. Lily wore it with her chin up, and when her best friend Sophie arrived and said, "You look like a real fairy," Lily smiled the way she had smiled that morning before any of it happened. But I hadn't let it go, and I wasn't going to. The party happened. It was, despite everything, a good party, maybe even a great one. in the way that events sometimes become greater for having been nearly derailed, as if the near miss lends everything that follows a quality of precariousness, and therefore preciousness, that it might not otherwise have had. Lily led 8 5-year-olds through the fairy scavenger hunt with a seriousness of purpose that made Dana laugh until she cried for the second time that morning, though for entirely different reasons. The flower crowns were a disaster in the best way, worn crooked and backward, and assembled with the cheerful disregard for proportion that marks a child's relationship with craft. Rosa's mushroom cake was, as promised, extraordinary, and the look on Lily's face when it came out candles lit. Everyone singing was the kind of thing you lock away somewhere safe inside yourself and take out when the world feels like too much. After the last guests left and Lily was asleep on the couch with her flower crown still on her head and her face still faintly streaked with buttercream, Dana and I sat at the kitchen table and talked about what to do. I'd already, while the party was happening, done 2 things. Asterisk. The first was that I had written down everything I remembered, times, exact words, the sequence of events, what I had seen and heard and what Dana had seen and heard while it was fresh. I had sent the notes to my email so they were times. The second was that I had looked up, for the first time with genuine attention, the Willowbrook HOA bylaws, all of them, every section. I had specifically looked up the sections that govern board member conduct, dispute resolution procedures, and the complaint submission process. What I found was clarifying in its own way. The HOA bylaws did, in fact, give board members authority to enter common areas for inspection purposes. They did not give board members authority to enter private yards without notice. The bylaw Marguerite had cited about exterior decorations applied to permanent fixtures, not to temporary party decorations. The common area adjacent restriction she had mentioned was real, but applied to commercial vendors, not private parties. And the decorative item restriction, when I read it carefully, was specifically limited to decorations visible from the street, which the mushroom figurines, placed well back in the garden, were not that. In other words, she had been wrong about everything, and she had not been wrong the way that someone is wrong when they misread a rule in good faith. She had been wrong in the way that a person is wrong, when they have spent years using the appearance of rules to exercise power they don't actually have, and have gotten away with it long enough to stop checking. I drafted a formal complaint to the HOA board. I sent it Monday morning, with a detailed account of Margaret's unannounced entry into our private yard, the inaccurate bylaw citations she had provided, the incident involving my daughter, and my request that the board address both the procedural violation and the conduct issue. I attached my time-stamped notes. I CC'd Dana. I also, because I had done my research over the weekend, CC'd the property management company that administered Willowbrook's HOA, a company that, according to its own contract with the neighborhood, was responsible for ensuring board members acted within their defined authority. What I had not anticipated was that our neighbor on the other side, a quiet retired teacher named Frank Okafor, had seen some of what happened through his fence. He had been pruning roses. He had heard Lily cry. He had not seen everything, but he had seen enough. And when he heard from his wife, who had heard from Mrs. Peterman, who had heard from Dana when she stopped by to pick up the extra folding chair she had loaned us, what had happened, he knocked on our door Sunday afternoon and offered to submit a supporting statement. It turned out that Frank had his own file on Margaret, a quiet, careful, meticulous file that he had been keeping for 4 years, not because he expected to use it, but because he was a man who believed in documentation. He had notes on 6 incidents involving other neighbors. He had dates. He had details. He handed me a folder with the mild manner of someone lending a library book. "I've been waiting for someone to actually file something," he said, at our kitchen table, drinking the coffee Dana had made. "People get tired. They move away. They figure it's not worth it." He looked at me. "Is it worth it to you?" She laughed at my daughter, I said. He nodded once, as if this were all the answer required. The HOA board met on the 3rd Thursday of every month. The meeting following my complaint was, by several accounts from people who attended Frank, among them, the most attended monthly meeting in the 11-year history of Willowbrook Estates. 14 neighbors showed up. 5 of them had their own complaints about Margaret, some of which stretched back years. The property management representative was present as well, which had not happened at a regular monthly meeting in anyone's recent memory. I did not attend. Dana and I had decided together that it would be more effective and more dignified to let the formal process run without our presence, so that the board couldn't reframe the situation as a personal conflict between us and Margaret. We let the documentation speak. We let Frank and the other neighbors speak for themselves. I heard about the meeting in pieces over the following days. What I was told, and I want to be careful here, because I only have second-hand accounts, was that Margaret attempted, initially, to frame the complaint as retaliatory, as the grievance of a neighbor who was upset about legitimate HOA enforcement. This framing apparently did not survive contact with the time-stamped documentation, or with Frank's careful 4-year file, or with the 5 other neighbors who stood up and said their piece. By the end of the meeting, Babur had voted to formally censure Margaret for entering private property without notice and for misrepresenting HOA rules in her enforcement activities. They also voted to require that all future enforcement actions be documented in writing before the visit, not after. Marguerite resigned from the board 2 weeks later. I heard this from Mrs. Peterman, who delivered the news with the particular satisfaction of a woman in her 70s, who has seen a great deal of the world and knows when the right thing has finally happened. I want to be careful about how I end this, because I don't think this is really a story about HOA politics or neighborhood disputes or even about Margaret Holloway. Not ultimately. I think it's a story about what we model for our children when the world is unkind to them. Lily asked me, a few days after the party, whether the lady who grabbed her dress was going to say sorry. I thought about how to answer that honestly and age-appropriately, which is always the specific challenge of parenthood, truth delivered at the right altitude. I don't know, I told her. Sometimes people don't say sorry even when they should. She considered this. She was sitting on the back steps, watching the oak tree in that unfocused way that children watch things that aren't quite anything yet, just being outside, just existing, which is something adults lose and spend the rest of their lives trying to find again. Did you tell someone? She asked. I did, I said. I wrote everything down and told the people who were in charge of making sure everyone followed the rules. Did it work? It worked, I said. She thought about that for a moment. Then she said, good, because she shouldn't grab people. No, I said. She shouldn't, and she shouldn't laugh when someone cries. No, I said. She definitely shouldn't do that. Lily nodded with the gravity of someone who has worked through a problem and arrived at a satisfying conclusion. Then she went back to looking at the oak tree. The dress, for what it's worth, came completely clean. Dana found a trick involving white vinegar and gentle cycla, and the lavender tulle came out of the wash looking almost exactly as it had the morning we laid it out in tissue paper. Not quite. If you look at the lower left quadrant of the skirt in direct sunlight, there's the faintest shadow